All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to ESM Starting Test Prep in 2023 webinar. Today, we'll be talking to you about just kind of the test prep timeline about when you should be starting prep for these tests and how to make the decision between the SAT and ACT and just taking a deep dive and getting you guys all started on it. So today's presenters will be me, Brian Smith. I am ESM's Director of Curriculum and a Senior Academic Mentor. And over here we have Eric Harter, who's a Senior College Coach, who will give you guys all the counseling perspective and admissions and what schools are kind of thinking about all these tests.
Sounds great.
Yep. So here's our agenda for today. As I kind of briefly said, we'll be talking first about all the kind of different test policies that schools are following these days. Then we'll get into sort of takeaways from the last couple of mission cycles we've seen from these test optional policies in particular. Then we'll switch more kind of directly onto the test prep side. We'll be discussing the test prep timeline for generally how prep usually goes over the course of the student's progression over these tests. We'll talk about SAT versus ACT. And then after we make that decision, then we'll talk about how to get started on prep and what to do. And then we'll end with a little bit of kind of general advice for specific classes. So Eric will get us started with all the kind of different
Yes,
policies that schools have these days and just trying to navigate all this mess.
and it's changing all the time. We recently had Purdue go test required, which kind of is a single university. That's kind of surprising, especially when a lot of our students who are in California. It's a pretty big conglomerate of students that apply to Purdue, so they're kind of looking at the California schools that don't accept it, and here's Purdue that's test required. So it's interesting to see schools revert back. We still have the vast majority of schools are test optional. And then quite a few are test blind. So the UC system, the CSU system, we know Reed and Caltech also test blind. But majority of the schools are test optional. The only schools that are test required at this time, as the recording of this, would be Georgia public schools, Florida public schools, and Tennessee public schools. University of Tennessee being the main one that is also test required. So that if those are target schools, if you want to go to University of Georgia, you want to go to University of Florida, it's imperative that you prepare for these tests, because in the end they're requiring you to send a test, and they want you to be in range. That's going to be kind of a big theme of, if test's optional, send your test, is looking at, are you in range with your test score? No doubt, if you're in range with the test score, you're going to be improving your chances of acceptance, because you're going to have a score that school's going to know you're in line for their rigor, their curriculum, and things like that. One
Eric,
of
can
the
you just
easiest,
really
yeah,
quickly just go over the definitions for each one? Like,
yeah. So test optional just means that you can choose to submit a test or not, and it's not supposed to be held against you if you don't submit the test. So that just means that you're going to be rated on your application, your essays, letters of rec, but minusing out the test. Or if you do have a good test score, you also send your test, and they're going to take that into account. Test blind, so that means they're not going to accept any test. So they're not going to give you an option to submit a test, even if it's on the application, which is sometimes kind of interesting when it will show up like it can be there, but they'll block it for their admissions officers so that they do not take into account at all in their evaluation. And then you have your test required. That's where they're going to require you to submit an ACT or SAT for admission. And if you don't, they will send you, we need this information before we can make a decision. So those are the three main differences between these. And probably the biggest piece of the puzzle in this last bullet is the early decision, early action numbers are continuing to rise, and just the sheer number of applications these schools are getting. And overall, I would say early on, we felt that test optional really hurt students in the early rounds. It's not as clear right now how schools are handling that. I still believe that if you're in the range, and the one way, a quick tip of how to see if you're in range for a school is just Google the school name common data set. Look at the most recent year common data set. That information will be on that PDF or where they're posting it. Not all schools post the common data set, but the vast majority do. You can see exactly what the 25th percentile to 75th percentile range is for a school. So if you hit inside that range, you know that you can submit your score. The main thing is, if you're below that range, oftentimes schools for their ranking want their test scores to be as high as possible. So admitting you below a test score range oftentimes means it's better to apply test optional, so you're not putting the school in that spot where they're going to make a decision for themselves. But overall, if you get a test that is in range for schools that you're targeting, it's going to benefit you, no doubt, and very, very valuable.
And it's pretty rare for there to be a situation in which you wouldn't recommend student test at all, right? It would pretty much be only if like they're if you've already decided that you're only ever going to apply to UCs or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Which even
And we'll
then,
talk about that in a little bit too, of kind of what would make you make a decision to be test optional. Overwhelmingly, my students, I'm advising to do prep and try and get a good test score, because no doubt it can stand you out. If there's two students that are very equal with GPA and now you have a test score, I think it's going to help your cause.
and so we've seen like a few schools start to go back to test required. Is that enough to call it a trend yet? Do we think there's going to be more going back? Do we have any idea yet?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, with the SAT, which we'll talk about going digital and changing, I just, in my opinion, purely my opinion, can't imagine that we're going to go away and stay in test optional forever. Just because why would they be changing? Like that costs a lot of money. That's a big overhaul. It's a big change. In my opinion, they wouldn't be doing this if they felt that the trend was just going to be completely, we're just going to be test optional forever. Do I think certain schools will likely be test optional from this point on? Probably. But I do think that we'll start to see schools revert back to test required. And we're seeing that. I mean, you saw that with Purdue this year. That's a big one that a lot of students, especially on the engineering side, can now, like, they're required. It's gonna if you're not in that range, it's gonna be a really tough spot for you to decide whether to apply or not. And maybe there's so many different variables. Maybe the school's trying to reduce the sheer number of applications they're getting because they were getting so many, they're having a really hard time just deciding. That's the biggest byproduct of test optional, is we've seen the sheer number of applications balloon 20, 25, 30%, double in certain cases, of where the acceptance rates are just getting so much lower because the sheer number of applications. And that's difficult on these admissions departments, which are in general not increasing their size to match that sheer number of volume of applications. So I do expect that with test optional, we're going to revert to test required, or more schools, especially the more selective schools, I do think are going to be in that spot.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking too, because I think MIT is the one that said that like we have done the
Yeah.
research and we don't really know why, but if students who do high on tests tend to do better at MIT. Like I think they literally
Yeah.
said that, which is kind of interesting. They just even MIT doesn't really know exactly how it proves. They just can kind of
Yeah.
guess, but it helps them. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think the really selected ones will probably start going to test required. They will probably follow MIT's lead. You know, these things tend to be
Yeah.
copycat behavior, right?
Yeah.
So
For sure. And
yeah.
I think a lot of it is just so that we will reduce the number of applications they get, so they are able to handle the sheer volume. I mean, these schools are getting so many applications since COVID that it's exploded and made the whole process difficult. Changing the ranges of schools that were likely 2 years ago for a student to being in range or being a reach, it has changed that dynamic a lot. But as we say, that we highly recommend students take these tests. There are sometimes that the option is best for a student to be test optional. That is, like, if you live in the state of California and you know you're only going to be applying to the UCs and CSUs, well, you definitely should not take the test, because they're literally not going to look at them. Do I think most kids' ranges and college lists should just be those schools? No. You should have a few more schools on that list, round it out, have some different types of schools. Maybe schools that are going to offer you a lot of merit money in a public setting, or a private school like Lewis and Clark in Portland can give a lot of money to students that have good test scores or just a good general application as well. So sometimes it can be beneficial to just be able to focus on just your extracurriculars or essays or letters of rec. In general, I don't think students necessarily look at it as, oh, okay, now I'm not doing test prep, I'm going to spend more time on this. It is generally, hey, I don't want to do that because it's tough. Like, Brian knows, like, he's in the thick of it, of teaching kids these tests. There's nothing that is really glamorous about it. It's a grind, but oftentimes it has such a powerful reward at the end that's really, really important. So test optional, yeah, it does give you extra time to focus on extracurriculars, your essays, letters of rec. Um, but I'd be cautioned if that's actually what the student's going to use that extra time, 3 to 4 hours a week, to do those extra things, which can, especially if a student has a lot of things on their plate. They have sports, they have different leadership clubs and programs and things outside of school that's taken up a lot of time. Sometimes it's best, but you just have to know that it can eliminate schools out of your range and out of your list, because you're not taking a test, and there's schools out there that will require it.
Yeah, and I think like that's pretty much the best summary of why we kind of recommend people taking this test is that we want you want to have the test optional decision for these different schools. Like you want to be able to
Yep.
decide, oh, I have these scores, should I send them to X school or not send them to Y school? And if you never take the test, then you just don't even get to make that decision. You don't get to optimize. And as Eric has kind of
Yeah.
shown, like optimizing your applications is really critical when there's such a high volume for all these kind of different schools, right?
Yeah.
And so, maybe you don't prep a lot, but at least take it just so you can kind of see where your score is at and, just start with that, right? And then you can make the decision from
Yeah.
there, right? Just taking a test isn't that hard. I mean, yeah. So
Yeah.
then you can go from
Well,
there.
and that's where like our diagnostics or a diagnostic test can
Yeah.
do one of each, can really tell you if you're starting really, really low, that maybe it's just not going to be in the cards. But I mean, we've seen some kids that had really low diagnostics that then do extraordinarily well through prep and learn the strategies of the test that is best for them, and see that it can change their range. I have multiple students in my head I'm thinking of right now that I know the test helped them get accepted to where they want to go. And the edges are, even every year, the edge between you and a student that is very similar is smaller, and there's more of them. So every little detail, and I mean, outside of just testing, the demonstrated interest, the seeing the schools, these little details are mattering so much more. Now you have a test that's going to tell this, that's going to matter more than a lot of those other factors, just because they'll know you can handle the rigor. There's a general level of acumen that certain schools will place on this test, like MIT, great example, that they're saying, hey, we just feel you'll do better if you do well in this test. And that's who we're going to kind of focus on.
Is there like a minimum score like you would recommend people get, or is that don't even want to
I
put a
mean,
number on it?
yeah, because I mean, it depends on what the schools that they're looking at. I mean,
Oh,
you have a school with like UNR that a lot of our students will target. They have a minimum, like if you get a certain score, it used to be 21, 22 on the ACT, and you were going to be guaranteed acceptance with a GPA requirement, I think 3.0 as well. So there's some schools out there that even what we would call like, what kids like, oh, I got a low score, can be very useful for
mhm.
colleges. So like with prep, I feel a lot of students are going to be able to get into those ranges where at least you have schools that are going to use the test. Very rarely am I in a student that with a student that is like, oh, I'm not able to use my score anywhere. It's generally going to be a very, very selective school, Ivy level kind of student that it has a 4 or 5, but is struggling to get higher than 28, 29, or 1350. But those in reality are pretty rare.
Yep.
And then sometimes they'll still have safety schools that their test is going to go for.
Yep.
And so it's one of those that I'm trying to think of through my students of this last cycle. I don't think I had any that took the test that it wasn't submitted somewhere.
Wow.
It is overwhelmingly that you're going to have your test submit somewhere that's
Mhm.
going to be in range for that school, and then you're getting a boost.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this is like minor, but they do other things too. There are some schools that offer scholarships for scores and
Yeah,
like that kind of thing, right? So it just, as I said, like, you just want to give yourself the option to get those rewards kind of in the future, right?
absolutely.
All right. So, okay. So we made a decision to take the test. So what does it kind of look like? Well, generally and broadly speaking, we have a little test prep timeline that we call it that sort of describes all the various sort of phases of where students kind of go through with in terms of of testing. So your starting point, which is where most students are generally at right now, either as juniors, sophomores, or freshmen, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about that later, is your first step, no matter what, is take SAT and ACT diagnostics, right? Students should take full length practice tests from both tests because like that's the first thing we need to make the decision about which test is optimal for the student, right? In
Yes.
terms of the college perspective, it doesn't matter. They don't care. Really. I
No.
don't think it matters like for any school at all anymore, right?
No, they just want the highest score for the test that's going to be that you're capable of getting the highest one for. And I can't say enough of taking a previous real SAT, real ACT, not a combo test, not a
Yeah.
test that is kind of like, what is this at? Like, no, this will give you the full scale. And especially like with our systems, I mean, the problem by problem, the problem grouping, all of the score reports that allow the mentor to see specifically where some strengths and weaknesses are is vital. Without those real diagnostics, and yes, official tests have some of these things, but those diagnostics are just they cannot be more valuable. And yeah, you have to spend some time doing them, but you have to sit down like taking the real tests. But for this process, it's so important.
The PSAT can substitute for SAT diagnostic to an extent, as long as it was taken, recently in the fall, and the student took it seriously, of course, which is not always the case, right? And that's mostly for juniors too. I would not. The 10th grade PSAT is significantly different enough that I would not use a diagnostic. The 11th grade one, that's fine, but still, ultimately, it is that the full SC is a little different. So if the student is at all able, I would still recommend they take both full diagnostics. We'll talk about the decision itself more in a bit, but that's always pretty much the first step. We want to pick a test that is the best fit test for the student as soon as possible, and they pick that test and they just focus on it, right? They just pretty much just forget that the other test exists, right? All right. So then phase one of the prep, we've picked a test. Now we're getting into the prep. This is what we call the basics. This is just basically like identifying any kind of core conceptual weaknesses, like for most students, grammar, since that's pretty rarely taught in school these days. Almost every student needs to learn their grammar. Various math areas is usually kind of the next step. Like, did the student take online geometry a couple years ago, didn't learn it at all, or forgot everything? Very common these days, right? Identifying those kind of weaknesses and just correcting them. These are relatively easy to fix. They take work, don't get me wrong, but it is just stuff that the student just needs to learn. So in the test prep perspective, it's pretty easy. So this is the first phase. Generally, this takes about 2 months for most students, right? Depending on the intensity of prep, of course, and how much time they're putting in, right? But this is about 2 months to really kind of shore up the basics. And this is also one of the most important phases because this is usually where we see the biggest jump, right? At the beginning of prep, right? Learning the basics, as I said, it's the easiest thing to learn. It's the biggest increase in score. So it's one of the most important. Because after that, there's still improvement, but you definitely start to see more diminishing returns. It gets harder. You really have to start kind of hitting the grind mindset. So that's what we call phase two, right? And that's the threshold. That's when the student has mastered most of the conceptual weaknesses. They feel pretty comfortable with grammar topics and that kind of thing. And so then the threshold is getting to the point where you're generally comfortable with the test. You may not have it like fully mastered, you may not know it inside and out, but you know each of the sections, you know what to expect, right? You know most of the grammar and math content, and you feel pretty comfortable. And this is where we start when students are at this point. This is generally when we say students are ready to take their first kind of official real test, right? Once they know what to expect, they know what it's like and that kind of thing, they're ready at this point, right? So generally about month 2 or month 3, so 2 months of prep about, and then take the first kind of real test, right? And so this first real test, most students take these tests 2 to 4 times. I would say usually 3 to 4 is most normal. So the first test, we generally want students to think of it as like more of like a practice real test. So they'll try to get your highest score, of course, but it's more just kind of see like what the real kind of test experience and like the environment, because it is different from practice tests, right? So then the final phase 3, this is after you've taken your first like 1 to 2 tests. The student now has a lot of experience with the test. They know what to expect. We call this the execution, stamina, and mindset. And all that's kind of saying is that this part of the test this phase of the prep is almost more mental than anything else. You know everything. Like, it's more difficult to make progress here because it's about full mastery of the test. You need to know the test inside and out. You need to have full confidence in your abilities to take the test. You really got to work to fully master it. And it's a lot of work, but this is really important if your student is trying to get a really high score on these tests, right? It's a really big phase. Basically, you can think of it as the full mastery phase, right? Full mastery phase. And it takes a lot of work, and it's a lot of just kind of working through sections and just learning the test inside and out, right? And so generally, this is where you want to be at for the second, third, and fourth test. Like, this is the optimal phase of prep where the student is ready to achieve their highest score, right? Once the student is at this level, we generally want to take the test like 2 to 3 times. So like at this point, once they've kind of gone through it, this is where students will start to reach their maximum score, basically, right? So you don't want to keep taking it. It's unlikely to expect too much more improvement at a certain point after this, right? So that's the timeline. Eric, anything else to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's also figuring out when to start the timeline.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when a kid is through algebra 2, you can definitely be in a spot to take these diagnostics. Sometimes you see like maturity and growth in junior year sometimes makes a big difference for the spring test. a lot of my high flyer juniors, the ones that are really strong, like sort of in sophomore year, we target kind of the fall of junior year, because let's say they're going to have 4 APs, they're going to hit AP tests in May. They want to prep for those. You're able to get ahead of the process there. So a lot of it is kind of dependent on the student. I've had students that just weren't ready in sophomore year, but when they got to junior year, they took spring tests, they just crushed it. And so it's kind of finding the right balance of at least getting, if you're a strong student that's sitting at some really high lofty goals, like a fall test, starting the summer of junior year can be really, really important. And for some kids, it's sophomore year. It's after freshman year, that summer prepping to sophomore year. Because once you get the score, you're done. You don't have to worry about it anymore. If you can get that out of the way sooner, I mean, the advantages that you have now, you just get to focus on AP tests and things like that. It can be huge to just have that kind of off your plate. So every student's a little bit different. So the vast majority of students still take it in the spring of their junior year. There's a lot of students that benefit it prepping through the summer when there's less curriculum and less things in your head.
Mhm.
And now you're able to go into a fall test. That first August or September test is kind of like, okay, I'm feeling it. And then that next test is oftentimes where you see a lot of kids hit a goal score because they've kind of hit that last phase and they're ready to crush it in those October tests in their junior year. And now they're done and it's out of the way, and it's a big relief.
Yeah, that's pretty much always the goal, like to have it done like at the latest before summer of junior year. Because yeah, like that summer we want to be starting on the applications, essays, all that fun
Absolutely.
stuff. For sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We've seen it
Semester
time and
tests.
again. Like the students
Yeah.
who always start prep like summer or junior year, it's a nightmare for them for the next like 8 months. Just an absolute nightmare. It's just too much.
Yeah.
It just is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they have so much going on, different applications,
Yeah.
different programs, different something. Generally speaking, a lot of kids are moving to varsity sports and like where they're now like, because there just ends up being just more that puts on your plate. And so a lot of it is trying to find the right balance. I mean, it's also sometimes tests early on for athletes. I should mention that. Having an early test where you can kind of hit a place markers when you're reaching out to coaches saying, hey, I got a 28, but I'm prepping. And now that coach feels, okay, he's probably gonna get to a 30. She's probably gonna get to a 31, 32, and feel like you can get ahead of the process on the athletic side too. So there's definitely benefits to starting earlier and avoiding those seventh semester tests when you are doing all your writing and doing all the different applications.
Yep. Okay, so the actual decision, SAT versus ACT. First, quick clarification. We are talking about the paper SAT for now. The digital SAT is coming up. It will be starting next year. So we will talk about it a little bit here and there, but we're primarily going to be focusing on the paper SAT, right? Which these dates that we have on here are all the paper SAT dates. In the US, the digital SAT will be starting next March, so March of 2023. So this December 2nd SAT date is the last paper test, right?
March of 2024, right?
20, that's it. Yeah, sorry, 24, March
Okay.
of 24. Yeah.
And also we have on our slide here, it says ACT dates of 2021. We mean 2023.
The dates are correct. The year is just
I
off.
messed up that slide. So yeah, it is all 2023. The dates are correct.
Yep. So we'll talk a little bit more about the digital SAT yet, but and it is a little different from the paper SAT, and especially in terms of making the decision between ACT, but we're not going to go in depth on that right now. Here we are talking about the paper SAT versus the paper ACT. International, if you have any national students watching this, it's different. Those are both digital for you. So don't pay attention to this part. All right. So the broad difference between the two tests is that the SAT gives generally on average gives a lot more time per section, where the ACT is much more fast paced and quick, right? So generally students prefer to take their time, be thorough, tend to prefer the SAT, whereas students who prefer the ACT are generally ones who are quick thinkers, are comfortable not being like 100% sure, like just are able to make decisions quickly and move on, right? That's the very broad advice, right? And so a lot of students, when they first take the ACT, will be not used to that time pressure and they won't like it for that reason. Don't just give up on it immediately. Sometimes it just kind of you just got to kind of get used to it and get a feel for it. Because if you can get the timing down, I would say the ACT is the easier of the two to get a high score. That is a big if. So make sure you're comfortable with the timing, right? We have a few other kind of specific things here, but broadly speaking, all of those points just fall under that kind of general idea of ACT being more time intensive, but easier if you can get the timing down, whereas the SAT is like they give you more time, but it will feel harder in that sense, right? And then in terms of the dates, as you can see, like there's basically a test almost every month except for during summer. The tests tend to alternate months. So there's like the test in March for SAT and then in May. And so May and June are back to back. And then in the fall, there's more frequent testing, of course, right? But these are all kind of the dates here, right, for those. Okay, so talk about all that. So then getting started, what do we need to do? Just kind of get right off the bat, right? Well, first start test prep, I guess, soon as the student is ready. Generally speaking, what we recommend with that is the student should be at least halfway through Algebra 2, right? If they're at least halfway through Algebra 2, they will have seen most of the math tested on both tests. And at that point, they're ready to generally kind of start working on it, right? Ideally, if they have finished Algebra 2, that'd be ideal. But if you're a junior and you're halfway through Algebra 2 right now, you need to start, right? And so then to get started, take these diagnostic tests. You can register at the link we have there, esmprep.com/practice test to sign up for free proctored exams, right? So you can sign up either for SC or ACT. Tests will be on the weekend. They are free. They are proctored. We'll send you full kind of detailed score reports that have full explanations of where the student's score is at, what their weaknesses are, that kind of thing. And that's the best way to kind of get started, compare the test, and then to kind of make the decision from there, right? So then once you've gotten those, once you've made the decision, the key is to prep continuously, right? Keep working on this stuff every day. It is much better to do 30 minutes of prep every day, daily, rather than, spending 6 hours on a Saturday doing prep. That's not effective. That's not really going to work, aside from maybe taking practice tests. You want to split up, especially if you're trying to learn a lot of content. If you're trying to learn a lot of grammar skills and math skills that are either new to you or review, you want to split it up. That's just the best way we as humans learn. Splitting over time is just, first off, it's just easier. It's just easier to dedicate 30 minutes in one day. And it's how we learn better. It's better to reinforce yourself like that. So I think that's really important. Build grammar and math skills weekly and even daily, really, is what I would say, right? And then kind of following on with that, try to keep a set schedule as best you can. Set aside time to work on test prep stuff continuously, right? Look at your schedule. If you're an athlete, right, that means you'll probably have to be doing later in the evenings, right? Take it easy on yourself if that's the case. It is hard, after a long day of school and sports, it's hard to focus. So maybe keep it more like the 10 to 20 minutes, right? But something every day is the key, right? Find gaps in your schedule to work that on, right? All right, so in this last one, don't burn your official resources too early. There's not a lot of official prep resources. There's both the College Board and ACT have official books that have practice tests. That is what we would recommend starting with. Those are the best starting points. They are the most accurate, but there's not too many. So what this is kind of saying here is like, don't just take all the practice tests immediately. That's not how you want to do this. Don't just start with just taking 5 practice tests like in 5 weeks. That will lead to some improvement as you kind of learn the test, but it will tail off pretty quickly because at some point you just need to learn the content. You're not going to improve if you're not learning the content. It's that simple, right? And there is a limited amount available, so you don't want to just kind of use it. In the beginning, it seems like there's a ton of stuff and it's hard to work through, but you'd be surprised over the whole full course, over 4 to 6 months or longer of your test prep phase, you need a lot of resources. So if you burn through those pretty quickly, you won't have any later and you'll be at a disadvantage because of that, right? Finally, cut yourself some slack. This is probably the biggest thing mentally, right? Students are used to seeing improvement very quickly, especially like for school tests, right? You can study for those in a week, sometimes even a day, depending on how hard the class is, and get at least a B or an A, right? That is not how standardized tests work. These standardized tests test years of content, years, right? So we measure progress not in days, not even really in weeks, in months, right? It takes like generally months of prep to see like good significant jumps, like 100 to 200 points on the SAT, 3 to 4 points on the ACT, and that's dedicated, consistent, targeted prep, right? So if you're seeing your scores not move too much, be patient. Take more time. It's months, right? Not even weeks, unless you're really grinding. Like if you can see improvement in a couple weeks if you are working a lot every day, but generally that's not realistic for most students. So be patient with yourself. Take your time. It is a process, right? Progress on this test is not linear, right? It tends to go in kind of jagged edges. You'll jump up a little bit, but then you might go down a little bit and then go up a little bit. But what you're looking for is that across the pattern of the test and your practice scores, you should be seeing a general trend of improvement, even though if it goes up and down a little bit in the middle, right? That's what you're looking for. So be patient, essentially, right? All right. Last kind of thing, takeaways and class advice. So a few kind of specific advice for each of the stuff. So we've talked about juniors a lot already. At this point, you need to be, if you haven't started prep already, you need to be starting prep right now, right now. And that means, yes, your next kind of 4 or 5 months are going to be pretty crazy and pretty intense. And actually, I would even say 4 to 5 months, your next basically, what, 11 months are going to be pretty intense. Yeah, about until this time next year, right? Sorry, it's just how it is, right? So get started, take diagnostic tests immediately, right? With sophomores, as I said, kind of depends. If you're in Algebra 2 right now, you are ready to start these tests. So same thing, take diagnostics. You have a bit more time to breathe, so you could take a kind of slower, more long-term approach. You should be thinking about the digital ST a little bit. If you're planning on starting prep right now, don't worry about it. But if you're planning on starting prep around this time next year, then you will need to be thinking about the digital SAT, right? Same advice for freshmen. If we don't generally recommend freshmen start as freshmen unless they are very advanced and they've already completed Algebra 2. So with most freshmen, you will probably be taking the digital SAT. So start thinking about that. Start comparing it to the paper SAT, right? Or paper ACT. Eric, anything else to kind of fill in there?
Yeah, I mean, as we get closer to that digital SAT, so March of next year, 2024, without a doubt, we're going to have a ton of webinars and resources and ideas as it starts to as the team starts to figure out what are they doing and how is it going to lay out and kind of adjust to something that's going to be completely different. So while it's not a huge factor yet, it's going to be a huge factor here in a year's time. So for you juniors, don't worry about it. For you sophomores, maybe, and freshmen definitely will be a part of your plan. But there'll be so many more webinars and resources that ESM will put out for this specifically.
Yep. So that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for coming. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at ESM Prep practice tests or just to our client services. Let us know of any questions. Otherwise, you students, good luck with your prep and good luck with your applications.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brian.